It's very clear the world's a safer place today. Qasem Soleimani no longer walks the planet.
I'm Julie Pace, Washington Bureau Chief for the Associated Press. And this is Ground Game. Welcome to the new year. 2020 is going to be an exhausting one. Just a week in, and the U.S. is facing mounting tensions with Iran after President Trump authorized a strike, killing one of the country's key military leaders.
If there is one thing we have learned in our modern times about U.S. involvement abroad, it's that when you don't have a plan or know what you're doing, when you act when there could have been another way, taking out a bad guy is not necessarily a good idea.
The Senate impeachment trial is looming. Oh, and there's less than a month until the Iowa caucuses. The Democratic race has been strikingly stable for the past few months, with a clear top tier of candidates leading the polls and raising eye-popping amounts of money. But if the past few years in politics have taught us anything, it's to expect the unexpected. It's in that constant state of anxiety where I live, as does Stephen Sloan, AP's national political editor, who's joining us on Ground Game to break down the sprint to Iowa and beyond. Stephen, I hope you got a little bit of rest over the holidays.
I got as much rest as I'm going to get for the next year.
That is a good way to look at it. I'm glad you're at least prepared. We are living in this extraordinary moment where the campaign some days feels a little bit like the third most important story. I keep saying to folks in our newsroom, we got to think about these as one story, because certainly what we're seeing with Iran, what we're seeing with impeachment impacts what's happening on the campaign trail. Let's talk about impeachment first. You have a bunch of senators who are competing in the presidential election who are also very quickly going to be jurors in the Senate trial for the president. How are they dealing with that? We don't even know when this trial is going to start. What kind of uncertainty hangs over their campaigns?
I mean, this is crazy for them. This must be maddening. I can't overstate how critical this period is between the caucuses on February 3rd. You want to be in front of voters every day. You want to be on television as much as you can. If you are doing big fundraisers, you want to be in front of donors. This is the moment to kind of close the deal. And instead, you have to sit in silence in the Senate chamber for an impeachment trial in which, there is no indication as of yet that the president is going to be removed. So this must be maddening for them. On a more practical level, they are kind of trying to figure out things like which surrogates will be out for them. Elizabeth Warren has picked up the endorsement of Julian Castro. You can imagine that he will be out there quite a bit for her. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, we can expect to see on the campaign trail quite a bit for Bernie Sanders. But there's still nothing quite like the candidate being out there. And this is an opportunity for someone like Buttigieg and Biden, who are not tied down by the Senate, to make their closing pitch.
I was just gonna raise that if you're Biden and Buttigieg, gosh, what an advantage that you could have almost a clear couple of days, almost a week in front of these voters where your rivals are sitting, as you said, silently in the Senate chamber.
I mean, for someone like Joe Biden and Buttigieg to a degree as well, I mean, Sanders and Warren have been their chief opponents, have been really railing them for a little while, and to have them sitting in the chamber, that's just, this is a gift for them. This is not what anybody wants to have happen if you're trying to win the Iowa caucuses.
The only person who might want to have this happen is Mitch McConnell,
who
would love the idea of mucking up the Democratic primary with the impeachment trial.
I mean, this whole delay is just, he's got to be enjoying that a little bit.
It is quite the political theater. So on a more serious note, we enter this new year with the U.S. and Iran really at a level of anxiety and tension that I haven't seen in my lifetime. And I'm curious how you think this impacts the debate on the campaign trail for Democrats. This has been a primary that has largely centered around Medicare for all, healthcare, as we've talked about issues, and then these sort of amorphous questions of how best to beat Trump. But suddenly we're dealing with a very real national security situation. Do you think that this starts to dominate the campaign trail?
I think it raises the stakes as voters make these assessments right now. It raises the stakes and could make people think twice about who they're leaning towards. So if you're thinking of Pete Buttigieg, you might like his military experience, but does this give you a moment of pause to say, do I really think that a 37-year-old who has run a city of 100-some-odd-thousand people is in position to lead kind of in this crisis atmosphere? Does that, in turn, also give someone like Joe Biden an advantage? He's been on the world stage for all those years. But he's also voted for the Iraq War, something that Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg are happy to talk about. So, we've been kind of having these conversations about Medicare for all and free college tuition. I don't want to minimize the importance of those issues, but I think this kind of takes the primary to a different place. There's nothing that a president can do quite like managing war and peace. And I think that has come into focus here.
Joe Biden certainly leans on his experience as vice president in these moments, talking about being alongside Barack Obama in the Situation Room during major decisions. In a weird way, you do feel like this could play to Biden's strength because this has been the sort of underlying theme of his whole campaign. I have been there. I am prepared for this. I can take us back to a place of normalcy. But I keep going back to the 2008 election where Barack Obama was less experienced. People worried about him in this situation, but they just were tired of the situation that we were in, and they went with a fresh face. He had the advantage of having taken a position against the Iraq War, and it looked pretty good in the moment. But I do wonder if potentially experience ends up backfiring here.
Well, both parties have this anti-establishment fever right now, right? And we certainly saw that with the Republicans in 2016. That is very much why Donald Trump is in the White House right now. And I think that's what Joe Biden is going to have to contend with. That is something that works in favor of someone like Bernie Sanders, who certainly does not represent any establishment wing of the Democratic Party, has been only extremely happy to highlight his opposition to the Iraq war vote. I think that is going to be an issue for Biden.
I think it's going to be fascinating over the next couple of weeks as the situation with Iran plays out. One of the things that I have been struck by over the last couple of months is how stable this race has been. We've seen Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Pete Buttigieg in some of the early states really consistently at the top. What do you think is behind that consistency, and what are you going to be looking for as we go through these next couple weeks leading up to the first votes?
Well, I think Democratic voters are struggling and trying to answer the central question of this primary so far, which is we still have more than a dozen candidates in the field, who is best positioned to defeat Donald Trump in November. And I think they don't know, and they're all kind of like looking at each other and looking at their neighbors and looking at which signs their neighbors have posted in their yards. And they're kind of, as everybody's looking over their shoulder, that's why I think we're still in this kind of place of stasis almost, where you have essentially a four-way race in the early states and in some cases nationally between Warren, Buttigieg, Biden, and Sanders. And that is what is going to make this next month so important to watch, because we're really going to see if that changes. And if it doesn't, then we're really looking at the possibility of a lengthy primary that could be pretty brutal.
Because what's unusual about this situation is that you could have one candidate out of that top four, or possibly a surprise, who wins Iowa, another one who wins New Hampshire, a third that wins Nevada, and a fourth that wins South Carolina.
And the whole point of this process, the whole point of the early state process before we get to Super Tuesday, is to start winnowing candidates, right? Especially in a field that is this big, we still have a pretty large field of more than a dozen candidates. The whole point of this process is start eliminating that down. So by the time you have voters across most of the country going to the polls, you kind of have like maybe 2 or 3 at the most, people that you're choosing from. We're looking at the real possibility this cycle that that's not the case, that we could be going into Super Tuesday with 4 or 5 people, and by the way, once you get there, you still have, Moneybags Michael Bloomberg.
Him.
There, who hasn't even participated in these early states and is spending a lot of money in places like California and Virginia, ready to compete there.
Bloomberg's money, obviously pretty extraordinary. He's funding his own campaign. But you do have other candidates, Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, who are raising really significant amounts of money that would let them continue to compete. I mean, we usually end up in this situation where even if you have maybe a strong showing in a state here or there, you just simply run out of money. We might not be in that situation.
I mean, someone like Pete Buttigieg, who, certainly appeal in Iowa and New Hampshire, has struggled in places like South Carolina and faces skepticism, I think, in the more diverse states that follow in Super Tuesday. But there is no reason to think that he's not going to make it to Super Tuesday with this money, which is just astounding that the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, now former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, is going to make it through Super Tuesday when Kamala Harris didn't even make it to the first votes. It's a really weird year.
It's incredible. It is a strange year. That is the one thing we can say for certain. So we are used to, in presidential elections, some type of last-minute surprise. Who are you keeping an eye on who potentially could have a surprisingly strong showing or an upset win in one of the early states?
I think we have to keep focused on Amy Klobuchar, keep an eye on her at least. She is all in Iowa, and certainly if she does a better than expected showing there, then that could carry her into New Hampshire. If she is at the bottom of the pack, it's it's hard to see how she goes on. I think the same is also true for Cory Booker. We, see that he continues to draw crowds. He is not kind of showing up to empty rooms. But, if he doesn't perform well in Iowa, that's going to be hard for him to keep the case going for moving forward.
We have been living in this space where candidates can dismiss polls. They can even quibble with the DNC qualification standards for the debates. But when you do get down to it, eventually voters have to vote for you if you're going to be a viable candidate.
It's the bottom line. At some point, voters show up and, determine their preference, and everybody has to live with the consequences of that. So, yeah.
Before we wrap up, Stephen, a couple quick things that I want to tick through here. You mentioned Michael Bloomberg pouring just an unbelievable amount of money. Every time I turn on the television, I feel like I see Michael Bloomberg in an ad. How are you, as a political editor, sort of preparing for this idea that we have a bunch of contests that are already happening, and yet one of the most well-funded candidates isn't even really going to be competing for several weeks?
Well, I think this is really kind of a two-track campaign in a way that we haven't quite seen before, right? Where we're very focused on the early states. We have reporters in all of them. But we can't wait until Super Tuesday arrives to start thinking about it, right? It's a thing now. And so we have to take that into account. And I think, we can't discount Michael Bloomberg's money. He is not polling very well right now, but the fact that he's polling at all and he just jumped in the race is kind of interesting, right? And people are tuning in to the election. He is making targeted messages in states that have just gobs and gobs of delegates on the table. So we've seen crazier things happen.
Finally, to bring our listeners into the room on our politics Slack channel, the fever dream of all political reporters is a contested convention. Yeah. We talked at the start about all of the money that these candidates have, the fact that we could end up in a situation where you've got the winners really spread out among a couple of candidates for the first couple of weeks. Contested convention. What do you make of it?
I think we'll know by the end of February if that's really a possibility or if this is just like every political reporter's dream every 4 years, which I still think it kind of is. It's really good television when you see it play out. So it's pretty amazing. But I think if we come out of the first 4 states with no clear consensus on where this nomination is going, it's not totally out of the realm of possibility. There's still a lot of, delegate math that comes in. There's just a lot of delegates that we'll see in March and April. And, we thought this in 2016. There was a brief period where we thought, we're heading toward a contested convention on the Republican side. That didn't happen. Indiana put him over the top, if I remember correctly. And we didn't even get to the end of the primary calendar. So it's a thing. It's a thing to keep an eye on. We shouldn't, dismiss it, but we also I wouldn't put my money on it right now.
He's saying there's a chance. That's my takeaway from this. Stephen Sloan, AP's national political editor, thank you so much for being with us on Ground Game.
Thank you.
As we wrap up this episode of Ground Game from the Associated Press, some exciting news. We're now airing twice a week. That's right, double the dose of political news from the Beltway and beyond. Be sure to tell a friend about us, and please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. From the Westwood One Podcast Network.